Okay, folks, so it's about to be round two. Haven't looked at the pairings yet, but I did want to tell you about a couple of things that happened in between round one and round two. One thing is I was gonna go get food, but then every place that I looked at made me kind of sick to my stomach, so I didn't eat. I'll probably eat after the second or after the third round. I've been skipping lunch sometimes these days. My uh, sleep schedule is kind of messed up, and so it's affecting my diet. But there are worse things in the world. So instead, I sat in the lobby of the hotel on like a nice big table and practice some Smith Morris stuff. I went through the intro of that book, which covers a lot of the interesting ideas there. It's a really hard opening, so if I get to play it, I might just lose. But the point is to like learn, right? So you play it, you do what you think is best, and then you learn why that move doesn't work in that situation, and then you move forward from there. It does require calculating a ton of tactics, though. Some positions are easier than others, so we'll see. But while I was doing that, somebody came up and said, "Are you on a call?" And I said, "No." So I took off my headphones, and they said, "Hey, my son here watches your YouTube." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I haven't met somebody that watches my YouTube in real life." So that was exciting. Shout out to Ray if you're there. It was lovely to meet you. And Ray won his first round game as black, so that's pretty exciting. Most of the time, he was telling me that he loses his first round game. So his dad was like, winning the first round game, that's going to be a good sign." So I'm excited on his behalf, and it was lovely to meet somebody that watches the content. I encourage the rest of you, if you ever see me in person, come up and say hi. I love meeting people. It's really flattering. It's really nice, and I'm always open to chatting with people, and hopefully get to play some of you guys at some point, which will be nice. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I have anything else to mention, but I don't think I do. I've got 5 minutes until the round starts, so I'm gonna head back in now. I think I'll probably have black, and it'll probably be against somebody higher rated than my first opponent. Um, but that's okay. Anyways, I will see you guys after the round.
Okay, folks, so we're into round two against Chayan Machanda. A very nice guy. Had actually a lot of fun going through the game with him after the game, which was pretty enjoyable. And I was playing black. So my opponent plays e4, and for the time being, we're an e5 player. That's just... We probably don't know enough theory in order for this to be the correct response for us to be playing, but I don't know anything else. Maybe I'll learn this Gandhi at some point. So knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and bishop c5. We are actually totally comfortable with the Gioco Piano and or the Italian game. Our opponent castles straight away, which is not the most aggressive move, but it's fine. We play knight f6. We would also like to castle. Our opponent plays knight c3, and we castle. A completely symmetrical position, very dry, very boring. The computer gives us as almost completely equal with a very slight advantage for white. So my opponent plays d3. And so what this now allows, as you can see, is for my opponent's bishop to come to g5 to pin this knight. And I don't like that, so I play h6. Totally reasonable. And so now the thing that the computer wants for my opponent to be playing from here is something like knight a4 to come get this bishop, force it to go somewhere that it doesn't want to be. But instead, my opponent plays h3, recognizing that at some point I'm going to open this bishop, and they want the same thing. We're both just sort of developing pretty reasonably. And I play d6. So now that we've played d6, again, the position is totally symmetrical. If you look, one pawn is up. We got a knight here. We got pawns here and here. We got knight, bishop, bishop, knight. All this stuff is here. Got to figure out what to do with these bishops. Totally reasonable. Our opponent plays bishop e3. And this is the first time in the game where we have the opportunity to get a slight advantage. Apparently, we're supposed to take here. They get the open f file. I never really like these positions because I feel like I'm getting attacked, and I feel like I don't know what to do against this pawn center. Like when I see this, I don't really know how to break this down. Like how do I take advantage of this semi-open f-file, which is open for my opponent and not for me? I don't really know. Apparently the answer is you play knight a5 and try and force his bishop to go somewhere that it doesn't want to go. And then when you trade it off, for example, knight a5 here, takes and takes, apparently this pawn center, despite being fairly compact, is apparently very slightly better for black. But in these positions, I play bishop b6 because I'm like, you can take me, I'll take the open a-file. Like, I understand what to do with that. I understand how to like push the rolling pawn center forward, and that's totally fine. So my opponent plays queen d2. Now there's potentially some thoughts of going over here. None of them work right now. If I make a nothing move, they can't play this. This is obviously just terrible for them. Yeah, it's minus 1.5, which is not as bad as you would think, actually. I guess they can play here, and they get 2 pawns for the piece, and my king is open. But how are these pieces getting into the attack? I don't really see it. At some point, I'm probably going to be able to harass this queen out and to be able to rescue myself, probably by moving my knight somewhere and then getting my queen into the action. Yeah, it wants me to play knight h7 so that I can play queen here, trade things off, and then be fine. Anyways, I saw that, and my first thought was like, okay, they're going to line up against the king side, and as long as we've got a compact defensive structure, I'll be okay. So I want to get my knight over to this square. The other thing that that's going to allow is potentially for me to play c6 and get this bishop back in. Right now, this pawn structure locks my bishop out of defense of this side of the board, and so my dark squares on the king side are weak. And so if I can get this pawn push in and get my bishop back, then I'm going to be able to reroute to this side of the board if I need to. So to get all of that started, I play knight e7. And my opponent plays knight a4. And things have been like pretty boring and pretty chill up to this point, and so I figured, okay, I spent a while calculating here, and again, I was like, I don't really mind. Like, you can take either direction and I'll be totally fine. Right now, this bishop's locked out of this side anyways, so if you're going to trade a knight, which could theoretically have come to this side of the board, and instead trade it for a bishop that wasn't really doing all that much, that's totally fine. So I play bishop e6 because my thought is, if take's there, then in theory, what I'd like to be able to do is take here. Unfortunately, that saves their knight, so they get 2 pieces for nothing. But if they, for example, take with the bishop, then actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to take here and sort of shred their pawn center in the middle. And now I've got this knight semi-open a-file. These pawns are a little bit awkward. I don't mind their bind on the d5 square because I'm going to get to d4 by routing my knight through. Like, this seems good for me, and the computer agrees. It is very slightly better for me. So I play bishop e6, and they're like, yeah, okay, we can copy each other. That's totally fine, except you've routed your knight here, and I've routed my knight there. That's pretty much the only difference in the board, and my queen isn't on d7 yet. And so I spend a while calculating, and I think, yeah, it's time. So I trade first one bishop, and then the other bishop, and so now they've got this strong pawn center, which is the thing that I was worried about earlier in the game. But the thing that I realized in this position is that I could play, there are a bunch of things I can do that are like, kind of okay. Like I can play c6 and just sort of like slowly roll it around and try and figure out how to infiltrate. And it's probably going to be pretty drawish because who's ever going to be able to get their pieces in? But what I can do is play d5, which I couldn't do with the bishops on the board. And I can basically say, okay, I'll undouble your pawns. But in exchange for doing that, we now can actually have play on this side of the board. And the thing I really recognize is that this knight over here on a4, it's not doing anything. Like it's not, there's nothing going on with it. So there are several things my opponent could do. Obviously, they can take here, but then like they can't take here because when I take, they can't take back because then I take their queen, obviously. So my opponent just plays e takes d5. I think that you can play here and it's fine, but I forget what the line is. And so if I wanted things to be like pretty boring, I'd play here. My opponent has the semi-open f file. I have the semi-open d file. It's going to be hard for me to fight over here. It's going to be hard for them to fight over there. Again, things are pretty normal with white with a slight advantage, but I said, no, we're going to open things up. And so I played knight e takes d5, trying to route this knight. Now, I did see, here's what I saw. I saw knight takes, rook here, knight back, and then either knight or rook takes, totally fine. Now I've opened up the e-file, and I control the e-file, which seems great for me. I actually don't even mind if they bring a rook over. I can just come back. My 2 knights defend each other. If they trade, that's totally okay. And if they bring another rook here, that's fine. I can just slide my queen along to somewhere that targets a bunch of the weaknesses and contest the file whenever I'm ready. However, that is not what is played. So I played knight here. My opponent does take the pawn. I play here. And my opponent plays... First of all, I also saw that they could play e4. I wasn't particularly concerned about that because takes, takes, and takes. And now I've got a rook in the center of the board. This is very, very slightly better for white. In fact, it might even be better for me to play queen takes in this position. I think this is slightly better for black. I just have dominant control of the central. Whose queen is better? Mine. Whose rook is better? Mine. Whose knight is better? Mine. These 2 rooks are the same. Whose pawn structure is better? Mine. So, like, I would be reasonably happy with this position. However, the pawn push that I didn't analyze is d4. And this is one which absolutely saves the knight. Now, it turns out there are some tricks and traps and things that I can do here. But this is the position where I didn't see this pawn push way back when I was calculating all the bishop changes and sacrificing this pawn and stuff. So now I actually just am down a pawn. But my opponent has this backwards e-pawn. This knight is like a little bit stuck in the middle of the board. But I'm also, to be honest, starting to lose control of the position a little bit. I mean, this knight still sucks. That's certainly true. Sorry, I thought I had a sneeze coming and I didn't yet. It'll be here in short order. But the thing I can do is play knight e4, centralize my knight, potentially push some pawns over here, have a really strong grip at the center of the board, and they're going to have to do some work. In particular, this knight is going to be unassailable if I can anchor it with a pawn. So, I mean, first things first, this attacks the queen. Great. So my opponent plays queen d3, and I think my opponent probably thought that I was going to move my knight back. There's nothing that I can do here, pawn takes, and then there's no cool discovery attacking this queen, not to mention the fact that it's defended. I could go back like somewhere over here, but then another pawn push happens, and I don't really know what I'm doing there. So I played queen h4, which my opponent did not see. Now, I calculated a bunch of things. The first thing I think I calculated was here, but Yeah, I mean, first of all, just knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes. Like, that's just obviously bad. What else did I calculate? I think my opponent can go here, but then I get to play knight g5, attacking their rook, sort of opening things back up. This knight is going to be able to wreak some more havoc. I'm threatening here. I can push this. This is all totally fine. And it's pretty interesting here, actually. The best move for them is just to play rook takes f7. And I think they were a little bit worried about takes here. Takes and takes. But in this position, they can take this knight back with check. So this knight is undefended. So it doesn't quite work for me. But I can see why they were hesitating there. And so they just played rook ae1. And so this actually ruins what was actually a pretty good position for them. They're plus 2.5 here. And now they're only plus 0.5, plus 0.7, something like that. The computer's still thinking. And the reason is, on the previous move, they could take this pawn, defended by the knight, right? And then I've got to find some way to kick this knight out to take the rook, but do it in a way that doesn't hang this knight. But now that they've moved their rook here, my queen is looking at it. And I, for the next, I don't know, 5-10 moves, I don't know exactly, but I was just like, let's do moves that encourage him to move this rook somewhere, because if and or when he does, I'm coming for this rook. I kind of recognize that this position wasn't really great for me. Like, I got a couple of undefended pieces in the middle of the board. My queen's kind of sidelined. You know, my rook isn't quite doing anything here, and the semi-open f-file worries me. But as knight's doing nothing, these pawns kind of suck. I'm only down a pawn. Like, let's get in there. So the first thing I did is I said, let's play rook 88. A thing that then I'd like to do is play, my opponent makes some nothing move. I'd like to play here, takes, you know, move the knight somewhere. I have a threat on this queen. If there's some way to get that to happen with check, in particular, if I can find a way to sacrifice my queen here, then I'll be able to get it back. Oh, and my queen defends my rook, which is dope. And then they can play here, and I have a queen and a knight for 2 rooks and a knight. The 2 rooks should, in theory, be better, but in practice, like, their pawn structure isn't healthy enough for this to be working for them. Yeah, wants me to play queen d5 and then find a home for this knight eventually, probably somewhere like here. Anyways, my opponent finally took on f7, which is something that I kind of overlooked for several moves. Like, obviously, I knew the rook could take, and I guess by extension, it's pretty obvious that the knight can take, but I wasn't really seeing that this was happening, and now that my rook is here, it gives a tempo to my opponent. So I said, okay, fine, that's a mistake. Let's play rook d7. I still want to have this pin going on. And my opponent plays knight e5. And it's just like, yeah, okay, I stole a pawn. I gained some tempi back. You know, you can move your rook here. And I thought about moving my rook there, but then I was like, how is this, like, helping me solve any of my problems? I don't really see it. Now the computer just wants me to play here, and it says takes and takes, and I don't know. Oh, sorry, that's rook ed8. Oh, it just wants me to move my rook back. It just says, look, you're dumb. You moved your rook up because it was attacked, and we moved back because you don't want it to be attacked anymore, and that's fine. But that's not what I played. I said, look, in for a penny, in for a pound. This knight has been a huge thorn in my side. I will totally accept the fact that that's not going to work out for me. So I played knight df6. My opponent takes here, and I take back with the knight. And in this position, it's +6 for white because they're up an exchange and they're up a pawn. They're up 2 pawns and an exchange. So they've got a rook for a knight and 2 extra pawns. This knight's kind of tenuous. These 2 rooks are actually doing stuff. This rook is, like, kind of not really doing anything. And their only bad thing is that this knight is on this side of the board. But then my opponent played the trap that I had been laying in wait for a long time. You notice that all the way... Oh, when is it? All the way back... is it here? Yeah. As soon as I played queen h4, the thing that I recognized, as I had mentioned before, was, oh, this is going to be an attractive move for my opponent. Obviously, in this position, it worked. It doesn't work because the knight has moved. But I was thinking, that's going to be an attractive move. And as we had mentioned before, as soon as my opponent puts their rook on the e-file, my queen is looking at it. So I was like, oh, man, this move is going to look tempting. So if we keep going, my opponent plays rook f4, just totally hanging a rook. And I looked at it like, and I took the rook. Now, if this weren't check, it actually wouldn't even be so bad. But it is check, so I've got to figure out something to do here. And so my opponent just moves back, rook f1, and I'm totally winning here. Because now, instead of being down in exchange of 2 pawns, I'm up a piece for 2 pawns, which is so much better. So now, it's a matter of trying to, like, continue to play aggressively. And my opponent was kind of sweating it out, actually, because, like, this is a non-trivial position for them to play. Now, my rook is defending my knight. So in theory, I can go back to queen h4, which is what I did, in fact, play. But I think probably the better move here is queen g3. It keeps an eye on this pawn a little bit better. It keeps defense of this c7 pawn a little bit better. And it prevents any, like, motion of these pawns, which isn't really going to matter for the most part. But it keeps me in a position where I'm defending this queenside set of pawns. However, that is not what I played. I played Oh, and the other thing in this position is if my opponent plays rook here, I can just go back, and again, things are totally fine. Like nothing's happening here. However, I played queen h4. My opponent plays queen c4 check, which I saw. I played king h8, and my opponent takes the c7 pawn, which I like don't really care about. So I played knight df6, which is the best move here. And my opponent takes the b7 pawn because they're trying to figure out what to do. And so now I'm thinking, okay, this king, there's just not that much going on with this king. And so I again managed to find the best move, and I'm minus 7.5 here. And I play knight d2. And so, you know, we're up on a player that's 1550. We're attacking his rook. He's got to find somewhere to move his rook. He can't go here because my queen takes. He can go here, I suppose. Which I think is what, in fact, he did play. Like, obviously going to these squares doesn't really help you very much. And I played rook takes e3. I think the thinking is if he plays here, then I get to play rook e1 check, king h2, and knight g4 checkmate. That's why this knight being here, as opposed to being in the center of the board, where it was before, matters so much. So my opponent can't even take the knight, which is something that I did correctly calculate. So my opponent plays queen c8 check. Now in this position, there are a few different moves that you could play. You can play knight e8, knight g8, rook e8, or you can step up with your king. Those are I think the only 4 legal moves, right? Now, 3 of these moves win. 1 of these moves draws. I played king h7. Oh, devastation. Look at the bar. Look at the bar. And the answer is there's a perpetual check here, but there's also a bunch of other stuff that could be true. Now, before we go there, let's see why everything else works. First of all, if I just move my rook back, the rook's attacking the queen, the knight's defending the rook. This knight is still wreaking havoc on my opponent's position. I should, at some point, be able to play here, takes, and here, move there. So, like, for example, at some point, you know, my opponent makes some kind of move. I can play check, here, there, check, here, and takes the rook. Although in this position, that doesn't really work, except that I can take the queen. So I guess at the beginning of this line, in order to accurately evaluate it, I should move my opponent's queen somewhere. So now if I play here, okay, that's better for, well, the queen's defending. So let's move the queen to somewhere where it's not defending that. Here. Check. Yeah, and so this is, again, it's mating. We're going to be able to come take this rook, and the queen's outside of the middle of the board. Great. So at least, you know, we go here, we're threatening the queen has to move, and then we can rescue our knight. In fact, we can probably just put our knight on e4, and then we just have to sort of round up this side of pawns while attacking this very open king, and our king is relatively safe, actually, here on on h8, because the rook defends it, and the knight defends the rook. So it's going to be hard for my opponent to do anything, and they can't even attack the rook with their rook, which they would like to be able to do, because the queen is defending that square. Rough for my opponent. Pretty similar, actually, if I play knight e8. We're still defending here. We're defending this square a lot, and we're actually getting ready to play something like rook e8. So, for example, if my opponent plays somewhere like here again, we can play here, here, and we're still minus 9.5. Also, we play knight g8. This is a more compact setup. So now how is our opponent going to check us? They have to attack this pawn somehow, so they should probably get their knight back into the game. And again, they can't take here because then rook e1... king here, queen f4 check, g3, and then, sorry, not that, checkmate. So all of those would have been fine, but that's not what I played. I played king h7, and I did see queen f5 check, and I saw, so first of all, I saw I can go back, and they'll keep checking me. Or I can play g6, which is what I played. And they played queen f2. Now, first of all, I can't take here because takes, and I don't have time to save my knight because my rook is under threat. And if I move a knight somewhere like here, they can just take my knight, and then my rook is still under threat. And so now they're just up 4-1 on the queen side. We both have a rook and a knight, so I can't trade queens in that position. I know that to be true. So apparently the best position here is knight f3 check, because you're going to get something like this, and then I'm going to be able to play queen g5 check. And then if I see, like this, then I get to play queen f4 check. And if here, so this actually threatens some checkmates. Fair enough. And so the result is they just kind of have to keep moving their king around. Fine. I did not see that. I played queen takes d4. And I calculated all of this back here when I decided to play king h7. I saw here, pawn up, queen check. Sorry, I saw here, queen check, pawn up, queen here, queen takes. And then I thought that my opponent couldn't play rook takes because rook here, and I thought double check, queen and rook, right? The king moves somewhere, And then I can't remember what I saw after that, but I thought that this was somehow winning his queen. However, that's not quite correct. So if we move forward, check here, 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 just like we saw, and we do play rook e1 check, which is only +2, and when my opponent plays king e2, I can't play the check that I thought I had, which is kind of rough. So there are several different things I can play. I played what is the best move. First of all, if I go here and there's a fork, the problem is that my rook is undefended. So the first thing I have to do is defend my rook with check. My opponent plays g3. I have to play anything other than g3 if they play queen g3 or anything else. First of all, I can just win his queen by going here. So takes, takes, takes. I've won his queen. I'm now up decisively again. If instead my opponent plays queen f4, obviously that just gives that up, and they can't move back. So g3 is the only reasonable move for my opponent. And then you'd think you can go here to pin the queen, but then just rook takes, queen takes, queen takes. So like obviously I'm just getting roasted there. And I can try and play here, but again the problem is I can just play here, and it doesn't matter that this check comes because the queen is still defending that square. So try as I might, I can't get this to happen without first moving my rook somewhere. And so I play queen e4, and the reason that I play that is because if my opponent comes down and takes this pawn, which unfortunately is with check, but if my opponent tries to do something where they leave the defense of this square alone, so for example, they try and move their knight into the game, then I just get to play checkmate. So I'm setting up threats, you know? I recognize that I fouled this up somehow, and so I set up threats. My opponent plays queen g2 and says, trade me queens, and I say, I can't trade you queens, queen e5. Perhaps it might have been better to play queen e3 here, but it's nice central in this board. I'm attacking here. I was also very aware of the fact that I didn't want to move somewhere where the knight could threaten me. My opponent plays knight c3. So now this knight, which has sucked, it's moved 34. And the knight moved to the a file on move 10. So for 24 moves, this knight has sucked on this side of the board, doing absolutely nothing. And now it finally gets back into the game. And that's why my opponent is +2 here. They're up 2 pawns, and their knight is actually doing something just like mine now. So this knight finally gets back into the game, right? Now, for me, it says I should play h5. I play g5. What I want to do is I want to like get up into these pawns. Basically, I'm like, look, I can come get your king still somehow, maybe. Like, continue to put pressure because I'm down 2 pawns, so I have to attack him. He plays rook e2 and says, please trade me rooks. Now, the trouble is that it forks my rook and my queen, so I can't like move my queen somewhere that defends my rook. 1, because the knight is in the way, but 2, like I'm gonna end up trading rooks regardless. So rook takes, queen takes, and I play queen c5, which I thought was the most resilient move. Knight takes, and then my opponent is obvious. Knight to the center, knight takes, and then my opponent plays queen takes. Now, here's where I have to admit something, which kind of sucks. I'm down 2 pawns in this position where we both have queens, and it's going to be a grind forever. So if I just move like king g7, and my opponent does something to try and make progress, I'm going to have some checks here, and they're going to have to spend a while consolidating this advantage, right? Like I'm going to be able to keep eyes on their threats. I'm going to be able to get over here. They're going to have to spend forever maneuvering around to get this to work out for them. And as long as I never trade queens, then they have to like continue to push and push and push and push. However, when they played here, I didn't see that this was check, so I just played here. I played that, and then they said, that's an illegal move. And I said, and they said, well, it's touch move, so the only other move that you can play is queen f5. And I said, yeah. And so I just resigned at this point, because now they're just up a queen. And I should say at this point, we both had under 10 minutes. Like, we were moving pretty quickly, and I saw that it was going to be a long endgame, which is why I wanted to, like, keep moving. And I just totally whiffed on the fact that that was an illegal move. So that was pretty rough. That was pretty rough. And if we look at the game review here, we can see, okay, my opponent's up. They start to gain an advantage. Sacrificing these chains is totally wrong. They lose their rook. Now I'm totally up. I'm mating. I play the only wrong move of 4 legal moves. Things are fine. I continue to play too aggressively, sacrificing my knight, and then things just sort of roll out of control there. Pretty rough. And if we look at what the game scores are, my opponent played 85.5, including 6 great moves, and I played 70.9, so I didn't play particularly great, and I played a couple of blunders, in particular ones that were really rough. And it's really tough because if we go back to that one more position one more time, if we go back to this position, if I just play rook e8, which I was thinking about doing, I was trying to get too fancy. I was like, I'm trying to play for mate, which I don't, I'm not upset that I was trying to play for mate. But if I just played like the easy consolidating move, the computer says the best move here is for queen takes rook. So if they play something like, I don't know, queen f5 here or something, then I just get to trade rooks. So as long as I block that check and force the queen to move somewhere, like it's made an 11 at this point. Well, let's take a look at the ratings. Okay, so for round two, we were playing somebody with a 1555 provisional rating, and we lost. So that actually moves our tournament performance up because we were playing so much higher rated. But our new rating is now 1119. So going 1 out of 2 against these two opponents, we'd be expected to go very slightly above 1, which makes sense. We were winning in that second game. Okay, so after 2 rounds, you can see that our first round we gained a little bit of rating, and then we lost just a little bit. So we're very slightly negative. But I mean, if you look at the y-axis, you can see that things are pretty standard here. So after 2 rounds, not so bad.
Right, guys, coming to you after game two. It's really hot, so I need to leave the car door open. It's just too hot inside this car to close the door, and the AC is going to make me totally unhearable. So I was playing black against, Chayan Machenda. Very nice guy. And he was unrated, but has a provisional rating of like 1550. And then online, he's rated like 2000 on chess.com. So a pretty hard game. But we played what I think is like a pretty good opening. Basically, it was an Italian game, and I think I figured out some of the Italian game a little bit. I did a good job of trading away the bishops, and then I ended up sacrificing a pawn to try and win as black. And I ended up in a position where I was down a couple pawns in an exchange, but then baited my opponent into losing their rook, which I had been setting up for several moves. And then I ended up a piece as a result of that, because I was down in exchange, and so then when you like win a rook, then you basically have a piece for nothing instead of a piece for a rook. But my opponent was up a couple of pawns, so then it was like pretty complicated, and I kept trying to play what I thought was the best move. I was trying to play really aggressively, and my opponent ended up being able to sort of liquidate, and then so my opponent ended up being able to win the piece back because I calculated incorrectly, which is my fault. I saw some things that didn't happen to be true, which like rough, but that happens. I can explain the exact miscalculation in the video. I thought a queen was going to be on f3 instead of f2, and then it was going to be like a pretty rough endgame, but I accidentally missed that I was in check, so I tried to like move my queen to put his king in check, and then he was like, you're in check, so I moved my queen back, and then he was like, so you have to move the queen though, and I was like, fair, but the only place to move my queen lost my queen immediately, so I resigned at that point. But we were both under 10 minutes on the clock, so a really long, a really interesting game, and a lot of fun. Props to my opponent. He sat down with me after the game, and we went over the game together, which is pretty interesting. Man, we really had an opportunity here to gain a ton of rating points, but luckily, since our opponent is like 400 points higher rated than us, losing doesn't really do anything for us. Like, that's the expected result. So frustrating to not get the win, but it's happened before, and we're going to keep playing our aggressive style. All right, see you guys in the next one.